So we head on down to Japan. Steve Klein is with Wyoming Liberty Group. How you been, Steve?
I'm doing really well, Glenn.
All right. Well, your article, just the title of it, got my attention. So does the state of Wyoming have what? Am I getting this right? Unconstitutional hiring practices? What's going on?
Well, what's going on is there's actually, they're considering extensive revisions to the Wyoming personnel rules. Lots and lots of them, and you can, of course, guys like you and me, Glenn, the quantity alone raises some constitutional questions eventually, but, from a lawyer perspective, most of them are in line. They might just be silly, they might just be far too extensive, but two in particular caught my eye, and I had a few different people who are state employees reach out to me over the past few months when they became available, and today was the last day for submitting public comment on the proposed regulations. So I should emphasize they're not regulations yet. They're just proposed amendments.
Okay.
And there was a comment period, and I submitted comments on two of these provisions. And one of them, in particular, the most dastardly one is, I don't know what you want to call it. You could call it the either the anti-communist provision or the anti-Ron Swanson provision, if you're familiar with Parks and Rec.
Let's combine the names. Ron Swanson, communist, just throw those together. That ought to get somebody's attention.
Yeah, and so basically what the one proposed, the one in particular that raises the most concern with me is allows rejecting the applications for state employment or refusing a applicant for further consideration if the applicant supports and or belongs to any organization which advocates illegal overthrow of the government of the United States and or the state of Wyoming. Now, I know that might sound a little bit like, well, Paul, of course, and I mean, we can always debate whether a person who really holds these beliefs is going to apply for state employment in the first place. But this is directly unconstitutional pursuant to a lot of cases that were decided back in the 1940s and the 1950s based on anti-communist provisions, the idea that we need to keep communists out of the government, and thereby we're going to play a little game called guilt by association. And we have the broadest First Amendment protections, not just to say what's on our minds, Glenn, but to associate with like-minded people and to even associate with people who we don't entirely disagree with, but nevertheless want to work with. So this is what's interesting, is this isn't prohibiting people who have directly called for the overthrow of the government. This is just guilt by association, whether you support or merely belong to any organization which advocates illegal overthrow. So the vagueness of this is pretty apparent. Like, what kind of organization is that? We've heard of the Communist Party, which is pretty small these days, but I think that's in their platform. There's, of course, some really outspoken neo-Nazi organizations, so it's a left-right divide. But what happens when you start looking at, say, something as benign as the Tea Party? What happens when you start looking at, say, the Oath Keepers? The Oath Keepers in particular call for fidelity to the Constitution, particularly the 10th Amendment, and they think that sheriffs and other people in state should not be enforcing federal laws that they believe are unconstitutional. Is that, depending on who you ask, a call for the overthrow of the government?
This is where I was about to get into this with you, Steve, because I looked at it and I thought, no, wait a minute now. If I'm somebody who, and I do this every day on the radio, I argue for limited government, and my argument is that most of what, let's just take the federal government, well, for that matter, the state of Wyoming, is doing right now, government shouldn't be doing it. So most of the state government and most of the federal government just needs to be shut down. Well, according to that measure, I want the overthrow of government. If you want to paint it with a broad brush, that sounds like I want to overthrow the status quo, and so I couldn't get a job.
Absolutely, and that's the big concern. And what if, again, we're not talking, if you hold those beliefs, if you're outspoken and you've got crazy stuff all over the social media and you're just a pure anti-government type, maybe there's a compelling interest there. Especially, of course, I'll acknowledge, and I mentioned this in the memo I submitted, we have the only place in state law where any of this is enshrined is for our Homeland Security, is for, police agencies. So the people who are tasked with preventing the overthrow of the government, yes, indeed, you could say that they shouldn't be calling for it. But even then, we're talking about mere association. So let's say you want to just go to meetings of certain organizations. You want to distribute literature. You really want to discuss what they're all about. What if you agree with everything they think except for that whole overthrow thing? This doesn't provide any cover for that. It's the fact that you're belonging to an organization that does this. It doesn't matter what you think. So this is, again, this goes all the way back to the 1940s and 50s where the Supreme Court was adamant, very clear, that you can't simply restrict people on their basis of beliefs, especially issues of public concern. You know, it's not like you're working for the Department of Transportation and calling for the assassination of your boss. And this is what's really funny, is you get into some really important case law following the 1940s and 50s where, unless it really relates to the job you're doing, your speech cannot be held against you even when you're in government employment. A great example was in the early 1980s down in Texas, a clerk working for a police agency heard that President Reagan had been shot, and she said something to the tune of, "Shucks, I wish he'd gotten him." You know, she wanted the assassination of the president. But it had nothing to do with her job. It's not like she said that about her direct boss. She was talking about an issue of public concern. Now, she was saying something really terrible. I wouldn't wish that upon any president, and we're free to disagree, but we need to have, even within our government, the ability to express dissent, especially dissent about these huge and very broad issues like the role of government. And that's kind of why I'm calling this the anti-Swanson provision, because if anyone has seen the TV show Parks and Rec, it's the show, he's the manager of a division of the Parks and Rec department, and he is virulently anti-government. And of course, the irony pervades that he works for the government, but he's a very funny, makes for a great, really funny character, and he says things that I think you and I, Glenn, more than often agree with. But I worry, and I think the people who are expressing concern about this provision in particular are worried that simple dissent on matters of public concern will suddenly make them anti-government.
Okay, so now there would be a difference between someone who dissented and verbally disagreed and someone who actually took action, did something dangerous, and caused some harm.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And again, this is something we often forget, and I'll admit I've often forgotten this, Glenn, is that too often I play lawyer. I'm looking at, let's look at the brass tacks of legal, and I need to find cases that support me and make sure somebody has said this before. Well, there's a bigger discussion about free speech to be had than simply what the Supreme Court has said about the First Amendment. The First Amendment, the First Amendment respects free speech, but it's not the end-all, be-all of free speech. And I think the quote that I put in this memo that, kind of brings, tears to my eyes, if I've had a glass of wine or two. But Thomas Jefferson, in the election of 1800, that was a historic election. That was when the Federalists lost power and the Republican small r took power, basically. And Thomas Jefferson, basically says in his inaugural address, he's talking about unity, he's trying to build a coalition, but nevertheless, he had this line, this immortal sentence: "If there be any among us who would wish to dissolve this union or to change its republican form, let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated where reason is left free to combat it." I mean, that is free speech in a nutshell. We need to respect that mere words, and this goes to so many things going on in Wyoming, anti-bullying discussions and things like that. We need to understand and tolerate the opinions of others, and we need to learn the response to that. If we're offended by something, engage it. Don't try to suppress it. Don't try and institute a government blacklist so only your approved people will work for the state, which is bigger and bigger here in Wyoming. 300 plus per 1,000 workers work for the government here in Wyoming. So that's the ultimate principle there is that what's the purpose of this? You really believe, first of all, getting back to the practical, do you really believe people who truly call for the overthrow of the government are going to work for the government and not do things that would be cause for firing, like actually try and overthrow the government? And then what's the harm? Why can't we have within government these discussions about its validity, about its role, about its breadth? Frankly, given how far, especially the federal government, has expanded relentlessly over the past few decades, maybe we could use a few more people saying stop within that system. And frankly, it's those systems that are most often attacked, where there are people who are allowed to say stop, where the system, I work against the Federal Election Commission. There's 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats, and they agree on stuff quite a bit. More often than not, it's when they disagree that progressives tend to get really angry and say that the Republicans are obstructing. Like, no, they just have a very different opinion and respect that whole First Amendment thing. So,
with Steve Klein from Wyoming Liberty Group, let me ask you real quick about the people, and understand this is just something that has been proposed. Nothing has been brought forward yet, but you're trying to nip it right now. But how did this come about? Who are these people that suggested such a thing?
Well, this is the Department of Administration Information here, or called it ANI down here in Cheyenne, and they do have a human resources division that can impact all human resources divisions across the state. And I don't exactly know the entire push for this. I'm concerned that this may be boilerplate that they've adopted and want to bring in from other states. I think there's just been, it's possible that other states have provisions this unconstitutional and we've just haphazardly cut and pasted it. Any number of things, but today was the last day for public comment. They take about 45 days of public comment. There will be a public hearing this Friday at the Hirschler building here in Cheyenne beginning at 1 p.m. So anyone listening online or going to be in the area, that'll be very informative, and I hope that there is a larger discussion certainly about this provision in particular, because when you start giving examples, when you start looking at the people that could be affected by this, it's a real chill. It's really chilling that people might be growing up and wanting to go to work in the civil service. And again, I'm a fairly libertarian cat, but I recognize that there are essential functions of government that must be carried out. And I want people of upstanding character. I don't want people who self-censor, who worry about who they associate with for years because they're scared they might be foreclosed from state employment. That's very silly. It's the chill of the blacklist. They're not censoring you. They're not fining you. They're just punishing you in a big enough way that you just might change your behavior. And that is the exact reason we have a First Amendment, to protect against this kind of nonsense.
Well, the next thing that comes to mind on this, again, as soon as I read what you had written there, I thought, well, wait a minute now. I understand with certain jobs, you have to have a type of a background check. I mean, if I'm running a retail store, I don't want to hire someone that's been arrested several times for shoplifting, obviously. But this kind of a background check, this means you're going to check into what my political affiliations are, what kind of church I go to, things like this to find out who I associate with, which means I no longer have a private life.
Mm-hmm. Well said, Glenn. And I think that's how I close the memo that I submitted. And I think you raised, it's such an important point. Like, the investigation behind this regulation is the creepiest thing. This goes right back to McCarthyism. This makes it appropriate for people hiring to ask, perhaps, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
Or with the IRS scandal just recently, what are the content? What's the content of your prayers? Mm-hmm. That one, you want to talk about brain gray matter across the walls of my studio when I heard that quote. Mm-hmm. So we're asking for the same thing in Cheyenne, in other words.
Yeah. So I'll be there on Friday, and I look forward to this, and I really appreciate Glenn, you bringing attention to this, because it's just a strange, it's a strange thing to me. I should stop being surprised at people who doesn't support free speech, right? Who doesn't support free association, but then, but I don't want you to have too many signs in your yard. That looks ugly. Yeah. And here it is. But I just don't want to work with you, you know? Right.
Well, when this is all done, I know when Wyoming Liberty Group posts something, I get, it in my email, which I encourage other people to do. Just go to WyLiberty.org and you can set that up with just like a click of a mouse. I would really like to hear how this comes out.
Absolutely. I will. Do you have a Friday show, Glenn?
Yes.
Maybe I'll call in the afternoon. We'll have something. Actually, it starts at 1, so I think it might go on pretty long. But
it's a 3-hour show, so. Yeah. All right. Thank you, Steve. Thanks for coming on. I appreciate it. I'll make sure that a few other people get to hear this as well, because if it's a comment period, can people get in on the comment? Do they have time left? How do they do that?
The comment period closes at the end of the day today, so I think realistically, maybe by midnight tonight, you could maybe still accept them. The public hearing is going to be this Friday. If anybody wants me to bring along comments, they can certainly email me. My website, or my email address, is on our website at WyLiberty, WyLiberty.org, and so I'm happy to carry that if people have other opinions.